The ground thrums like a frantic heartbeat. You don't see the tank, you feel it. Dust rises first, then a rumble that seems to churn from the Earth's gut, a rounded, metronomic sound, as if someone had set an iron clock to march. The German soldier presses his cheek to the damp soil, trying to distinguish infantry steps, but what cuts through his ear is something else. Hurried tracks, a high-revving engine, a different timbre than what he was used to calling ours. When the silhouette appears, low, fast, compact, there's a jolt that isn't merely military, it's primal. The mind names Stuart, but the body first names threat. And here war meets Jung. Man and his symbols reminds us that images are the primary language of the psyche. On the front, the M5 arrives not as a spec sheet, but as an archetypal figure, a steel bull piercing the landscape, testing the firmness of the self. The curious thing is that, technically, it's no Colossus. A 37mm cannon, armor an experienced German knows can be overcome by the 50mm of a late Panzer III or the 75mm of a Panzer IV. Yet, at first contact, the mental impact is greater than any spreadsheet. The machine's shadow occupies the space before reason can even sit at the table. The scene could be Sicily, 1943, or an Italian village the following winter. In both cases, reports converge on one detail. The M5 accelerates, rounds a corner, spits short, rapid bursts, brakes and accelerates as if it had the pulse of a motorcycle. The high-dramatic transmission of its Cadillac engines gives fluidity to its movements. The hull dances over irregularities, and this disorients. The German soldier, trained to recognize the patterns of large tanks, the slower, gravely noisy monsters, finds this lighter, nervous animal strange, one that doesn't respect the solemnity of an entrance. This isn't to imagine universal panic. Veterans don't romanticize the enemy. But the first impression, the one that floods the system with adrenaline, is of the unexpected, and the unexpected always seems larger than it is. Jung would say that the projection of the shadow, that which we deny in ourselves and see in others, activates when the real becomes a symbol. The M5 at this moment becomes a screen onto which the German projects the fear of modern times, swift technology, industrial warfare, the possibility of being outmatched not by a rival hero, but by a system that moves faster. Then comes the irony that will accompany the entire narrative. The American M5 Stuart tank is by no means the material dread of a panther or a tiger. It is precisely its lightness that makes it mentally irritating. Like a mosquito in a closed room, it inaugurates the phase of psychic nigredo, the initial confusion that psychology and alchemy describes as the chaotic mixing of opposites. The soldier needs to hold two conflicting thoughts. I can destroy it, and it can see me first and flank me. This friction awakens a state of hyperattention with ambiguous contours. It protects and exhausts. There's the short shout from the squad leader, "Cover!" There's the reflex to seek higher ground, and there's the moment when the noise approaches and the ground again thrums. The mind begins to work not in sentences, but in images. A steel maw spitting, tracks biting into mud, a hull ricocheting pebbles that hit the wall like hail. Perception contracts into a tunnel. And here a decisive detail. Whoever quickly realizes that the M5 seeks to observe and fix, and not necessarily break the line alone, gains precious seconds of life. Back home, we might say, haste makes waste. But on the front, haste can sometimes save your life, provided you know what you're rushing into. The mental attack of first contact requires immediate digestion. Recognizing the M5's operational pattern, scout vehicle, infantry liaison, exploiter of gaps, restores some agency. The German who understands that the M5's weapon is as much its speed as the radio it carries begins to target communication, neutralize the observer, blind the platoon, cut the chain of command. It's here that cold statistics begin to seep into the veins like an antidote. The 37mm struggles against the frontal armor of the Panzer IV. The side is another story. The upper hull has vulnerable angles. The low silhouette disappears in vegetation, but it needs to expose itself for fire support. The brain tries to transform myth into map. It's the struggle of consciousness to strip the archetype of its totalizing power, beginning to see the enemy not as an impersonal dragon, but as a set of dependencies: fuel, a four-man crew, limited low-light vision, coordination with infantry. So far, everything sounds technical, yet the Jungian layer insists on superimposing itself because war is not just calculation, it's an internal theater. A sleep-deprived Gayfrieder sees the first M5 appear on a narrow street, at high speed as the metallic echo collides with the facades. The short barrel sweeps left and spits a burst, and the German retreats behind a broken counter. The sound of the .30 caliber machine gun on the hull seems like iron rain. He remembers an instructor saying, "Light machine, trust the terrain, overcome fear with geometry." And it's precisely geometry that adrenaline steals. His hand trembles as he mounts the sight. At this moment, man and his symbols would have much to say about dreams of pursuit. The pursued runs down a narrowing corridor. Doors won't open. A beast catches up. The psyche repeats, in waking life, the fable of the dream. The question that echoes isn't, what is the torque of this engine, but will I be reduced to a number? Here, we'd call that a blank. The mind just goes dark for seconds. The return is stark. The sergeant slaps his helmet, points, speaks rapidly, updating the scene. Consciousness once again begins to slice the symbol into usable parts. What is learned from the first anecdotes of contact? That noise and speed are not mere aesthetics, they are psychological weapons. Some report that, in the first minutes, the entire platoon cringes as we cringe when a bus scrapes by on the street. The body calculates the distance, like someone measuring a gap to jump a creek. Then comes the assessment of real risk. Is American infantry right behind it? Is it a spearhead or a probe? Is there more than one? The veteran German then possesses two invisible resources that Jung would call elements of the individuation process in extreme conditions. First, recognizing the shadow without succumbing to inflation, admitting fear but not becoming fear itself. Second, summoning compensatory images that sustain the self. Some used dry humor, small but noisy. Others used directed anger. Don't let them call for reinforcements. Others, emotional memory, a face, a promise. None of these tricks replace discipline, but they modulate the anxiety curve which, if it escapes, steals exactly what decides survival: the ability to perceive detail. It's important to say, not to romanticize, that there was no magic. Germany had material antidotes, anti-tank guns, grenades, Panzerfausts that, especially later, changed the game in urban areas. Still, even before the snap of action, there was already an invisible battle for the interpretation of the symbol. German doctrine, effective in recognizing the enemy's strong point, taught to break the rhythm of reconnaissance units. When the M5 appeared and retreated quickly, the mistake was to chase the ghost and fall into the artillery's maw. The right move was to mark it, call for precise fire, take out the enemy's eye, to transform the presence into a controllable event. It seems obvious behind a desk, but there, with dust clinging to your gums and the sweet smell of gasoline in the air, the obvious needs to be relearned at every turn. Psychology and alchemy describe stages of transformation. On the front, the useful transformation is this: to move from reaction to rhythm, not to move to the other's beat, to impose your own beat. The numbers help bring the myth back to earth. Between the M3 and M5, Stuart's totaled over 20,000 units produced throughout the war. This means ubiquity, and ubiquity generates familiarity, and familiarity diminishes the spell. As 1943 turned into 1944, many soldiers already knew how to distinguish the sound of the two Cadillac engines, more acute, from the deep diesel of other machines. They knew that the 37mm cannon was not a death sentence against a well-constructed entrenched position. They knew that the M5's advantage was elsewhere, arriving first, seeing first, speaking first on the radio. The mental weight then migrated from the steel to the communication. The frightening enemy revealed itself to be a knot in a network. This shift in perception from the isolated object to the system is a kind of psychic albedo, clarification. And it brings a sober conclusion. Initial panic is often noise without a score. The score is logistics, positioning, discipline, meteorology, fire schedule. In plain English, it's not witchcraft, it's method. Even so, the images persist. At night, some dream of giant beetles scuttling across the tin roof. Some hear in the silence the engine's rotation like a bad mantra. Some, opening and closing their eyes, see a short barrel swinging like a pendulum. This is not personal weakness, it's an expression of a working psyche. Jung didn't prescribe suppressing the dream, but listening to it. What in the figure of the M5 threatens you that isn't the M5 itself? The speed? The feeling that the world is passing you by? The idea of being observed and reported, reduced to coordinates? When the symbol is deciphered, some of the enchantment dissipates. We learn early on to not give phantoms the time of day. Face them, name them. A clear-headed German does this in the field. He draws the tank silhouette in his mind, points out weak spots, repeats procedures, shares with his comrade. The ritual of naming dries the dampness of fear. There's also the role of irony, so human, that accompanies the first part of this story. Many Germans, when facing an M5, felt a mixture of technical contempt and tactical respect. Contempt because, in direct duels, their medium tanks and anti-tank weapons had an advantage. Respect because the M5's agility, paired with infantry and artillery, bit where it hurt: communication, flank, morale. The greater irony? Sometimes it was precisely underestimating the little tank that proved costly. Jung would say that the trickster archetype, the deceiver, infiltrates light, fast, seemingly weak figures. The M5, when well used, acted as a tactical trickster. It didn't win by brute force, it won by shifting the fight's center of gravity. At the end of this opening, the stage is set for the chronological development. We will see stories of survival that depend less on bravado and more on reading the terrain. Technical details that became psychological antidotes. Perceptions that evolved as familiarity with the M5 stripped it of its numinous veneer and returned it to the concrete world of steel, oil, and human error. But before we move on, it's worth recalling the core of the initial impact. The first encounter with the M5 Stuart is a test of translation. Those who translate quickly act with precision. Those who don't translate freeze under the mystique of the symbol. And as Man and His Symbols reminds us, the symbol doesn't exist to deceive us, it exists to be read. Here, we'd offer the advice without poetry. Breathe, observe, name, act. That's how the trembling soldier retains enough tremor to remain human and enough firmness not to surrender to the noise. Because, in the end, war demands precisely this: an intimate agreement between the part that's afraid and the part that leads. And that agreement, which begins in a dusty alley when a light tank turns the corner, will say much about who returns whole when the noise finally fades. Dawn in Tunisia tasted of fine dust when the first German platoon realized the high-pitched sound didn't match the monsters they'd learned to fear. It wasn't the deep thrum of a tiger, nor the sooty roar of a panzer crossing a ford. It was a lighter, faster, almost impatient growl. The M5 Stuart appeared quickly, its hull bouncing over the hard ground, its turret cutting the horizon like a young bull's head. The Germans threw themselves into the wadi's depressions, and there began the lesson that would repeat throughout the war. To survive meant to quickly translate the symbol, to strip the numinous figure of its real gears, to look beyond the gleam of first impact. The commander took 2 breaths, signaled with his hand, and the gunner shifted his aim not to the center of the hull, but to where he believed the radio was, to blind before wounding. American doctrine used the Stuart as eyes and ears. This detail, more than any spec sheet, shaped the German reaction over time. The M5 was light, with armor that performed no miracles, armed with a 37mm cannon and 30 caliber machine guns. Its strength lay in speed, clear radio communication, and the habit of arriving first, observing, and calling for fire. By understanding this, German platoons learned to listen to the engine's pauses as much as the infantry's steps. The automatic transmission gave the sound a characteristic rhythm on ascents, an extra footfall that betrayed the maneuver. Where there was once enchantment, there was now pattern, and where there is pattern, there is method. In the veteran's mental map, the M5 became a knot in a network that needed to be cut. The order wasn't heroic, it was surgical. Don't chase the light tank in open country. Don't run after the mosquito and fall into an artillery trap. Don't allow it to observe for too long. The game was to break contact, force the Stuart to seek an angle, extend an invisible net of fire that punished haste. In forests, the strategy was almost pastoral. Let the tank penetrate too deeply, cut off its supporting infantry, and then hit its sides where the armor yielded. In villages, the theater of doors and windows, the narrow corridors, the old trick of making the street seem empty until the last second, all paid off. The secret wasn't in raw courage, but in the geometry of fear. Measuring distances precisely, even when the mind wanted to shorten everything into a tunnel. Italy, 1943. A German corporal estimated the Stuart's dance among olive trees like someone measuring summer wind. The machine appeared and vanished, fast, spitting short bursts to fix gazes and force errors. The German platoon had been burned before by this choreography, raising heads at the wrong time, firing too early, revealing positions. This time, they did it differently. 2 men with automatic rifles dealt with the close-following American infantry. A POC-38, quiet, awaited the first sight exposure. When the Stuart locked its turret for a second, as if breathing to look, the anti-tank guns spoke. The hull shuddered, choked, and stopped like a fish out of water. The silence that followed brought relief and weight in equal measure. There was no euphoria. There was the cold recognition that the trick only works when your head is screwed on straight. On a psychological level, Jung would have called this turning point albedo, clarification after chaos. The negredo of the first encounter, that confusion where the symbol dominates, gave way to a gaze that separates. The Stuart ceased to be a monster and became a sum of dependencies. A 4-man crew, limited vision, need for cover, hunger for information. The shadow, that rejected part of ourselves that we see in the other, ceased to hijack the scene. The Germans stopped saying, "It's invincible," and started saying, "It's fast and communicates well." This simple phrase contained the key to the antidote. To cut off its voice was to cut off its daring. In open terrain, the confrontation was unequal in other ways. The M5 wasn't designed to duel with medium tanks. Its function was to clear a path, flank, and reconnoiter. The Germans learned to instruct their gunners not to be enchanted by the wrong target. How many times did a gunner miss a chance at the command vehicle because he fired half a dozen shots at the attention-grabbing Stuart? This target discipline, almost monastic, became standard. Psychology and alchemy describes the work of separating substances to achieve the final red. On the front, separating priorities was the spiritual work that saved lives. The light tank, however noisy, could not hijack the will. We have a saying, "Don't be swayed by the noise, focus on what's necessary." It's a piece of urban survival advice that would fit in any combatant's pack. In reports from units that fought in France, the scene repeated with variations. The Stuart appears on roads with high hedgerows. American infantry pours into ditches. The radio sings. Those who take a breath and remember the tactical diagram save themselves more often. Those who respond to the noise as if it were destiny become statistics. This doesn't mean there wasn't raw courage. It means that useful courage was the kind that obeyed an invisible design. At the end of the day, stories that ended with a return to camp always had the same refrain: hold your position, suppress magical thinking, treat the machine as a symptom, not a god. There were also encounters where the M5 was an unwitting teacher of humility. A German section, overconfident after 2 quick victories, advanced too far along a dirt road too good to be true. The first Stuart retreated at speed, fleeing. 2 minutes later, the ground erupted in dust and steel, radio-guided artillery, bullets sweeping the formation, and a second M5 cutting in from behind a house, biting the flank. What seemed like prey became the trickster, the archetype of the deceiver that Jung described so often. The lesson was bitter. Don't let lightness deceive you, because it carries the weight of an entire system behind it. The platoon returned smaller, and morale only didn't break because someone managed to narrate the defeat as an accelerated course. The right word is also logistics of the soul. In cities, the terror was different. Narrow streets, confusing echoes, windows that seemed like eyes. There, the M5 lost some of its advantage, and the Germans gained a bargaining chip called proximity. The Panzerfaust, a short and fierce weapon, allowed for an intimate duel that the psyche barely endures. Imagine the soldier's breathing on the stairs, his sweaty hand, his ear trying to separate footsteps from cracking sounds, his stomach convinced that everything will collapse at any second. The tank appears, its side exposes its ribs, the man fires, a white-orange flash, and the world turns to glass and smoke. There's no glory in it. There's nausea, there's trembling, there's a silence that lasts longer than it should. When the dust settles, the soul is disarranged. Man and his symbols would remind us what we label as courage is often the provisional pact between the part that trembles and the part that acts, and that pact collects interest later. That's why dry humor and small routines, sharpening a bayonet, reorganizing ammunition, writing something in a notebook, are part of psychic hygiene. Germans who made it through 1944 with some sanity spoke of keeping your head screwed on straight. Translating Jung to the trench, preventing psychic inflation, not marrying the image of the machine nor that of the hero. The hero who believes in his own cape makes mistakes. The mechanic who believes everything is mechanism loses his soul. Individuation there on the roadside was accepting that there's a piece of iron inside you, the part that functions without emotion when it needs to, but that it doesn't rule the rest. Those who don't make this mediation become a cog in a panic or a bravado. Statistically, the massive presence of Stuarts, along with their M3 cousins, taught by saturation. The more encounters, the less aura. The mental impact dropped because the senses learned to recognize the choreography. The Americans, in turn, adjusted their uses. Fewer duels, more reconnaissance, more infantry support, more of a bridging role for medium tanks to get where it mattered. There were, of course, exceptions and improvisations because war is noise, but the trend was clear. And this cross-learning recalls a Jungian principle. Opposing systems, when they confront each other for a long time, begin to assimilate traits from one another. The enemy's shadow becomes a tool. The German adopted methodical haste. The American lent European caution to a vehicle that seemed too young to respect danger. In the middle of this analysis, a simple request for those following with a faster heartbeat than average. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming videos, because the third part will delve into the most unsettling layer, where numbers and dreams intertwine and the machine leaves its mark on sleep. Comment below what you think about this and tell me where you're watching from. This conversation gets better when we share experiences. Let's return to the field. The M5 had a virtue rarely celebrated on commemorative plaques: reliability. The dual Cadillac engines and automatic transmission required less maintenance than some rivals. This meant it was present, and presence weighs on the mind. On the German side, knowing that a Stuart could be around the next corner didn't elect fear. It elected prudence. And prudence, repeated 1,000 times, becomes a stance. The right stance reduces the chance of foolish error. A sergeant used to say, "Orient your body as if the enemy is there, but only give your soul when you're sure." It's almost a paraphrase of Jung hidden in field advice. Don't marry images before seeing what they carry. Time advanced to 1945, and the Stuart no longer made headlines. Other larger tanks dominated the stories. Other weapons captured the imagination. Still, in the pockets of war, it remained the first to arrive and the last to be remembered. Perhaps that's why its mental impact is so interesting. It's not the shock of the colossus, it's the unease of the agile. The hardened German soldier no longer even looked at the hull as the main threat. He looked at what it signified in the chain: eyes, radio, rhythm. And rhythm is still power. Understanding the other's rhythm was, for many, the beginning of reclaiming their own pace. If there is a moral that concludes this stage of development, it fits into a phrase whispered because shouting doesn't suit learning. The symbol commands until the moment you name it with precision. The M5 Stuart entered the war wearing the archetype of swift danger. It left it as a legible piece of a weapons system. Between one thing and another, there were men trying not to be reduced to the noise they heard. And in that attempt lies the dignity that technology cannot steal. Noon split into two halves when the first shot ricocheted off the stone wall and returned a metallic scream into the chest of whoever was hiding behind the ledge. The air smelled of sweet gasoline and wet dust, and the summer light seemed to mock any prudence, hitting the Stuart's hull and transforming it into a shimmering animal. The German soldier closed his eyes for half a second, and in that interstice settled the climax that separates those who freeze from those who translate. It was no longer the shock of the first encounter. It was the test at the center of the bridge. Either the image devours the action, or the action tames the image. Jung would call this moment a confrontation with the shadow, that which you don't want to see in yourself. Haste, impersonality, cold calculation, appears before you in steel and tracks. And what do you do then? The street was narrow, like so many in rural France, with high hedgerows and curves that seemed designed for skirmishes and ambushes. The M5 came once again as if out of nowhere, its engine revving high, its turrets searching for an angle, its machine gun clearing the way with short bursts. The German, who months earlier would have fixated on the hypnotic gleam of that movement, now released his gaze to the whole picture. Two American riflemen glued to the rear, a radio blaring somewhere behind, an unusual silence on the other side of the road indicating space for a hidden gun. His body wanted to fire at the hull. His mind, trained by pain, wanted to cut the network. And it was the mind that won. The burst hit the radio man. The tank, for a second, saw less. Statistics are people stacked in numbers, but sometimes they carry light. Up to that point, the presence of M3s and M5s on so many fronts sent an objective message: ubiquity, reliability, speed over 30 miles an hour on roads, two Cadillac engines that rarely abandon them. Add to that production exceeding tens of thousands across variants, and you understand why there could be one around every corner. If panic springs from a feeling of inevitability, the antidote begins by dismantling the theater of inevitability. In the sum of probability and terrain, suppose destiny becomes a calculable risk. The 37mm weapon was not a death sentence against German medium tanks, and the Germans knew it. But the rate of fire, vision, and radio communication came at a cost to morale. The enemy that arrives first doesn't need to be the biggest. It just needs to arrive sooner and speak louder. The intermediate climax wasn't a heroic explosion. It was a silence inside his head. The Gefreiter, who had been on the verge of a blank so many months ago, now took a deep breath and held the image long enough to name it. Psychology and alchemy describes the transition from chaos to clarity as a change of substance. Here, the substance was attention. The Stuart, a few months ago an iron demon, was now a legible symbol, eyes and an antenna. And legible symbols do not govern. The soldier shifted 2 steps, saw the hull hit the street's curb, understood the suspension pattern working, imagined the turret's line, and realized that, to see more, the tank would need to advance another inch. In that inch-wide crack lies the difference between being pushed by time and pulling time to your side. The cold air bites inside the nostrils, but it's the sound that defines the instant. A short vibration on the gravel, the elastic growl of engines revving up and down as if breathing fast, the dry clatter of tracks biting into stone edges. In the winter of 1944, the M5 Stuart wasn't the knockout punch, it was the bell that rang before the fight. It emerged around the bend, spied, spat short bursts to mark its presence, retreated a few yards, and, almost always, brought friends: infantry, artillery, medium tanks. For the hardened German soldier, the mental impact no longer came from the myth of an unstoppable colossus, but from the practical realization that this light hull meant a network. In Man and His Symbols, Jung describes how certain images ignite entire chains in the psyche. The Stuart, by then, ignited not just fear or bravado, but anticipation, radio, coordination, new orders in the air. The entire body began to operate based on a simple, decisive question: what is this eye on tracks seeing that I haven't seen yet? This shift wasn't born in theory, it was born in the flesh. The first phase, the Negredo, had already been traversed by those who survived the initial shocks of 1943. The chaos in which the light machine seemed larger than it was. The projections of the shadow transforming speed into monstrosity. Then came the albedo, the clarification of the pattern. Where there's a Stuart, there's a radio. Where there's a radio, there's articulation. Where there's articulation, there's a risk of chasing the bait and falling into the hook. The rubedo of this process, for many, was disciplined habit, separating symbol from task, transforming the exciting image into a sequence of cold, useful actions. Psychology and alchemy speaks of this work of separation as a spiritual kitchen, distilling what serves, rejecting what intoxicates. On the front, this meant not confusing provocation with objective, not wasting ammunition in a duel of vanity with a light vehicle that, by doctrine, was not born to duel. Morale also learns by association. In more than one sector, the mere news of Stuarts on the front was enough for platoons to reform lines, delay impulsive counterattacks, and redistribute ammunition and observers. The course of events changed less due to direct confrontations and more due to repeated micro-decisions. Not leaving cover on impulse, not chasing apparent prey, not succumbing to the trick of exposing oneself in a spot the enemy artillery would have just marked. There were instances where a perfectly camouflaged POC-38 refrained from firing at the first tempting target to wait for the command vehicle that came later. This patience altered the rhythm of an entire afternoon. Jung would remind us that psychic maturity is not about killing images, but putting them to service. The Stuart remained a strong image, but now it was integrated. An indicator, a prologue, a prelude to the larger orchestra. In Italy, all of this gained the relief of the Apennines. Narrow valleys, vineyards alternating with forests, villages stacked on hillsides where a light hull seems larger than it is, an ideal setting for the archetypus of the provocative quickness. American and British units used the Stuart as a diligent scout, and Allied forces circulated on roads where these tracked eyes were part of the traffic of war. For the German, entrenched above a village, seeing an M5 cross the square, Break, retreat, and disappear meant that someone had inventoried the terrain and, very probably, described their position in coordinates. The influence on morale was silent and effective. It forced the exchange of impulsiveness for geometry. Break contact with precision. Change angle. Blind the observer. If the symbol said network, the effective response was to cut wires, not punch the spider. The M5's influence on German morale was also seen in what it didn't do. It didn't breach bunkers unsupported, didn't tear through streets alone, didn't scale hills without cover. When it risked going against doctrine, it paid dearly. And seeing the enemy err heals wounds. A Stuart bogged down in a vineyard, track spinning, the crew fighting their own haste, restored the feeling that industrial warfare, despite its engines, still depended on human nerves. In Jungian terms, it was the discovery of the residue, that which doesn't transform into gold even after being heated. The myth shrinks when you see sweat, hesitation, and logistics behind the armor. None of this, however, canceled a weight that came from above. With consolidated Allied air superiority, every daytime movement seemed an invitation to punishment. The M5, due to its ubiquity, became a mental prologue to the air attack. When it appeared around a bend, many already heard, ahead of time, the whine of fighters. The mind stitched presence with the near future. This undermined imprudent courage, pushing decisions towards cold calculation. Jung would describe this chain as a symbolic constellation. One image ignites others, and together they form a climate. The climate was this: if there's an eye, there will be a hammer. And this rewrote routines, schedules, and forms of movement. By late 1944, the M24 Chaffee began to replace the Stuart in many Allied units. On the German side, the legend of the light one that arrives first needed revision, because the new tank came with a more capable gun and a distinct silhouette. Even so, the M5's mental mark didn't fade overnight. In sectors where mud, cold, and logistics delayed the exchange, it continued to arrive early, scout the terrain, and call for support. The human brain doesn't swap symbols at the speed of equipment rosters. It insists, for some time, on reading the world with the old templates. Thus, the useful habit remained: listen, measure, distrust, cut communication, avoid pursuit. German cities offered chapters of intimate tension. Narrow streets, echoing facades, windows that seemed like eyes. There, the Stuart lost some of its advantage, and infantry with Panzerfausts gained prominence. The duel happened at close quarters, and the psyche paid for every inch. An anonymous soldier described the ritual he invented so as not to be hijacked by fantasy: pressing his palm against the wall and feeling the vibration of the tracks, counting to 4, crossing the right window, breathing through his nose so as not to miss the sweet smell of gasoline, only then firing. The objective was not heroism, it was to prevent imagination from running ahead of the body. Sometimes it worked. Other times the very proximity exacted a high price. A white-orange flash, shrapnel hitting the face, the taste of dust on the tongue, an uneven silence that hearing took time to recompose. What Jung would call inflation, being taken over by the archetype of the machine or the hero, needed to be watched as one watches a fever, without denying it, without surrendering command. We often say, don't be swayed by the noise, focus on what's necessary. That phrase fits in a 1944 backpack. Platoons survived because they maintained priority targets, observers, radios, command vehicles, and ignored the glamorous duel against a provocative light tank. Others fell when lightness deceived them. One section imprudently pursued a Stuart retreating on an inviting road. Minutes later, artillery swept the perfect ambush curve with the cold precision of someone erasing a mark on a board. The trickster archetype, so frequent in Jung, had a body of steel and a radio in that theater. The light tank seduced the eye, but hid, just behind it, the heavy bite. If there's one place where the Stuarts' influence on morale can be clearly measured, it's in sleep. With the front moving and fatigue piling up over weeks, dreams carried residues like wheels turning within. Men reported internal engines, chases down endlessly curving streets, short barrels appearing and disappearing like pendulums. Jung would say this isn't weakness, but language. The psyche trying to settle accounts with images that traversed it too quickly in daylight. The remedy, then, was to name. To give exact names to parts, repeat procedures, draw silhouettes, share instructions. To transform myth into map. When an image gains a caption, it loses the right to govern the gesture. The legacy, curiously, began before the last shot. The language of reports changed. Cocky little tank gave way to eye on tracks. Recognizing the Stuart as a sensory organ of a larger force repositioned the inner dual, from pride to communication. When you transform an archetype into an organ, it descends from its pedestal and becomes a tool. This has moral effects. Less humiliation in the face of shock, less euphoria in the face of success. A discreet but resilient balance. In Ion, Jung speaks of the ego-self axis and the temptation to inflate oneself with collective images. Keeping one's head screwed on straight, as exhausted soldiers said, was to prevent the ego from confusing itself with machine or mask. For those watching, there's a useful mirror in the post-war era. Stuarts and their relatives served in various Latin American armies, including Brazil, as training and presence machines. What in Europe sparked trembling in snowy trenches became routine barracks life under a hot sun. Driver courses, firing exercises, military parades. This translation from the numinous to the everyday doesn't diminish the past, it clarifies it. It shows that powerful symbols lose their spell when they pass through the workshop and the classroom. The image remains strong, but now in service of life, not panic. Before we move to the final conclusion, a direct invitation. If this analysis has opened a window for you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the last chapter, and share it with anyone you think needs to hear this. Comment below on what surprised you most: the lightness that weighs heavily, the network behind the hull, or the realization that our minds, in shock, react with myths before reacting with maps. The advance into the final phases, then, was not a blind rush. It was a rehearsal of forced patience. The M5 Stuart continued to appear as a comma between patrol and bombardment, as a prologue to heavier weapons, as a reminder that modern war has eyes and speaks. The German soldier who returned whole from this period learned a silent technique: to breathe over the image until it loses its skin of enchantment. Useful courage is not chasing what provokes, it is choosing what saves. The rest is method, protecting the soul so that the hands do what they need to, listening keenly so as not to confuse trick with destiny, accepting limits without yielding dignity. If the Stuart began the conflict as a swift ghost and ended as an organ of a network, the psyche that confronted it traveled a similar path, from enchantment to utility. This journey is valid outside of war. When something noisy turns the corner of your everyday life, a diagnosis, a layoff, a police report, a late-night phone call, the lesson the M5 left in the European trenches serves us here too. Breathe, name, cut the network of panic, aim for the essential, work with method, and preserve a place within yourself where no machine commands. As for the final statistics that help frame the narrative with facts, we are looking at a vehicle that, combining its variants and close relatives, was produced in high enough volume to be in practically all major Allied theaters of operation, that served as a platform for reconnaissance, liaison, and infantry support, that, when used within doctrine, rarely decided alone, but frequently decided together as a spark that activates larger mechanisms. That, in trained hands, could impose rhythm, and rhythm is one of the invisible currencies of war. On the other side, the losses also speak. Light tanks pay dearly when they overstep their role. Every burnt hull reminds us that all doctrine has an edge, and every bitten edge exacts a price in metal and lives. The sum of this, morally, is subtle. The adversary who learns to read you accelerates their own maturity, and maturity, in war, diminishes bravado and saves useless pain. If we are to close with force, let it be by telling what remains when the smoke clears. The dignity of those who refused blind fascination remains, neither the idolatry of the machine nor the vanity of the gratuitous challenge. The image of a hull that taught prudence remains, the memory that eyes and radios can be worth more than muscles, the realization that the first combat always happens within. Above all, the uncomfortable truth remains. The symbol commands as long as it is unnamed. When it gains a name, the symbol becomes a tool, and a tool, in the right hand, builds bridges over craters. If this deep dive helped you see history inside out, from inside the mind, subscribe to the channel to follow future content and share it with someone you think needs to hear this. Comment below what resonated with you and tell me what city you're watching from. This dialogue comes alive when we cross experiences. And if any detail provoked disagreement, bring your source. Honest conversation is the laboratory where historical narrative gains precision and humanity. In the end, I leave you with an image and a phrase to carry in your pocket. The image: a dusty village, a light hull turning the corner, a platoon breathing as one body, not chasing the spell, aiming for what's necessary, and getting through the moment with their heads on straight. The phrase, which summarizes the ethos of this account: courage is translating before shooting.